I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence here. I'm also joined by my colleague Elise, who, if you could wave a mix of no and say hello. Oh,
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
I'm in 2020 and forgot to unmute. Sorry. Yes, my name is Elise. I'm a researcher in the evidence team, and I will also be presenting some findings today.
And we're also joined by a colleague from the University of Leeds, who's been working with them through the Centre for Cultural Value, and that's John Wright. We'll say a quick hello before we get underway.
Hi everybody, yeah, so I'm with the Centre for Cultural Value, and we did a research digest on everyday creativity earlier in the year, so I was brought in to respond today. Yeah.
So the format we'll do is we'll say a little bit about some initial overall findings. That'll be Elise. I'll unpack a little bit more. John will give some initial reflections, but also then we'll be really keen to hear your thoughts, reflections, questions, comments, etc. Afterwards. So I think that sets us up really. I'm really pleased that we're covering this particular topic because there's so much of the work that we do that ends up focusing a lot on attendance of various sorts, attendance at galleries, attendance at theatres, and we all know that there's much more to arts and cultural engagement than just that. And so it's really nice to actually be able to give some due attention to participatory activity. Hopefully that will sort of throw up some interesting things. We've been looking at data from the Cultural Participation Monitor, which is our nationally representative panel survey. And in this last wave, partly supporting John's project, we introduced a whole range of questions about participatory activity. We have been asking about that the whole way through the monitor since October 2020, but we added some extra questions. We asked them questions a bit differently this time, and part of what we'll chat about is what asking those questions differently ends up throwing up in terms of what it shows as engagement, and particularly more inclusive ways of thinking about participatory engagement. So I'm going to pass over to Elise for the first bit. Pausing only to say, if you want it, there's transcription at the bottom. Do ask any comments and questions on the way through. And if anyone wants an audio description of me who hasn't had one previously, I'm a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, middle-aged male sitting in an incredibly dull-looking small room, sort of just white background basically. So yeah, so that's what I look like. Over to Elise.
Thanks, Ollie. Hi, everyone again. Good to be back for another ski break, focusing on creativity and participatory activities. I am also very pleased that we're doing this topic because I myself take part in a lot of creative activities, so I'm glad it's getting some spotlight. And this first half of our talk is going to be focusing on how basically there are more people who are doing more, who are being more creative, is kind of the first big finding we found. And this was sort of comparing what people were doing before the pandemic years and what they've done in the last year. So what we're kind of considering more recent, we could call it post-pandemic, but you might also not say it's quite post yet. But yeah, looking at pre-pandemic habits and more recent habits, what we're basically seeing for every activity that we asked about, numbers are going up. So we're seeing that people are doing more across the board, no matter which activity they're into. There are, of course, some more popular activities, such as reading and being creative with making food. Those are obviously more ubiquitous activities. And we see creating with the natural world, so stuff like gardening, that's had the biggest increase in terms of percentage points increase. So that's the first thing to note. But what's also interesting, which Ollie mentioned, is that this list of creative activities is quite new to us for the Cultural Participation Monitor, in that we have expanded the list to what we used to ask about in terms of creative activities. So Ollie, if you could just switch the slide. Basically here we have just a little view of, in the last wave, which was in April, we asked about creative activities since the start of the pandemic, and this would include your more traditional activities such as visual arts, performing arts, music, photography, writing. And for this wave, with the new partnership, we have extended that list to include a lot more things such as graffiti art, magic tricks, things related to food or to gardening, fashion, style, gaming as well. And we've really seen a big spike in terms of people telling us that they do creative activities with this new broadened definition. So yeah, you can see from 45% to 86%, so quite big. And what we've also seen that's interesting is that those new activities are in fact more popular and more ubiquitous than what we would call the more traditional activities, just in terms of us using them more traditionally, not in terms of them being more traditional. But so on the next slide, you can see here how it is those in red here, the newly added creative activity, the ones in the outer ring, were a lot more popular, and especially the ones related to food and to nature. And then also fashion, gaming, discussions. And obviously the blue ones are still very popular, but we can see there how they're slightly lower in the scale, with crafts being the most popular of those traditional activities.
Just one thing to
yes,
if I can, it's not only did we add these extra categories, but we also made explicit in some of the examples in the existing categories that we were thinking about in a broader way. So visual arts, we explicitly included things like graffiti and street art.
Absolutely, yes. We provided people with a long list of examples of what they might want to include, to kind of try to prompt people to think of the things they do in their everyday lives as creative activities. And we've seen a real payoff with this. And not only that, but it's also important to note that people are very rarely doing just one activity. In fact, the vast majority of people were doing more than one activity. 4 and 5 people who were answering did at least 2 activities. And of the 20% who only did one activity, a lot of the time this was related to food. And we saw this food category to be sometimes the creative activity of people who elsewhere in their lives are not really engaged in other creative activity. So it might be an interesting one for us to track in the future, but it might be interesting for you as well to think about when you're thinking about which creative activities your audiences might do, or you might be trying to program with your audiences, and so on. But essentially, yes, this is kind of an overview of the lay of the land and how, since the pandemic, people are engaging in more creative activities, and we've been able to capture that, especially with our broadened definition and trying to be more pertinent with prompting people properly to think of their lives as more creative. And I will now pass over to Ollie to look at some more interesting details within that picture.
Okay, thank you. So I guess this really backs up the idea that really everyone is creative. I guess this is very much aligned with the New Arts Council strategy, that, you know, creativity is something that is very broadly engaged in. It's really not a niche activity. However, we are seeing, amongst various other differences within the data, that broadly speaking, some groups are less actively engaged in these participatory activities than others. So we're seeing, for example, older groups tends to have lower levels of engagement against this range of categories. And that's also true when you think about overlap with attendance behaviour. So generally speaking, if people haven't been to Arts and Heritage in the last 12 months, are also less likely to have done it. despite the fact that lots of the participatory engagement, as we'll see in a sec, is in the home. So it's not necessarily they couldn't get there, but they also have this sort of overlap in terms of interest or motivation. However, the other way of looking at this same set of data, so we'll just recolor our bars, is to look at these different categories as they sort of group together, and we can see that those differences I've just mentioned, so relatively lower engagement by older age groups and relatively lower engagement by non-attenders, so-called, is much less once you start including the other categories like nature and food. So again, that's a way of maybe sort of blurring some of the boundaries and sort of suggesting there is a slightly broader, more fully representative view of creativity. Moving on here, what we've got is a look at these activities that people have been doing and which ones are being particularly done in the home, and which ones are, if you like, the most popular. So, you know, relatively speaking, this, in a way, the height dimension of this is a representation of what Elise showed first up. So making food is top, and then the other one's going down below it. But generally speaking, the things that people do most often are the things that people do at home, which kind of makes sense because it's the most accessible place for people to do things. It's also, I guess, an environment for creativity which has lots of barriers removed, not just in terms of getting there and travel and also other things, but also that thing about kind of like a safe private space where you can just do your thing seems to be part of it maybe. And we see, generally speaking, these newer categories tend to be higher on both those dimensions. So generally speaking, as we're kind of looking at things beyond the kind of like this so-called traditional categories, they tend to be done more at home. But for all these categories, they were actually more prominent at home than elsewhere. So that's right across the board for, you know, writing, visual arts, but nothing else, whatever. So again, that's maybe something interesting to note. One thing just to say on the way through, because we've referenced gaming a couple of times, we were explicit that it's about creative gaming. So it's not about, let's say, Assassin's Creed. It's more like kind of, I don't know, Roblox or Minecraft or more creative versions of that. So another difference, so we went on to ask people, of all the activities that they'd picked, what were the things that would help them do it more differently or better if they wanted to. And indeed, we've got all sorts of other data we can look at another time, which is about which activities people did want to do better or not. But we could see within that there tended to be a difference of the kind of intervention people wanted. So there were typically, cost keeps coming up as a kind of key driver. Ideas and inspiration is quite important across the board. But for some activities, there's a kind of slightly different tilt depending on where people are. In fact, this is one of the things I thought might be interesting in terms of what Keith was saying about a strategy around engagement. So here are just two particular examples. You can see that, relatively speaking, if people are engaging outside the home, they're more likely to be saying they want to have access to technology. It's about sort of access to networks and people and communities and things. It's about ways of disseminating results. In a way, kind of once you've gone public, the next step is to go, if you like, more public. Whereas if we're talking about engagement within the home, yeah, cost comes into it really, really prominently, skills, inspiration, and materials, which would suggest, and obviously this is only two particular art forms picked because they're a bit of a contrast between sort of newer and the older versions. But it would suggest that depending what your strategy is, might depend which kind of things are most important to prioritize in terms of supporting additional activity. And that it might be that we often think about the kind of more visible external public activity, but it could be that's further down the line in terms of people's development, that people often will start at home and maybe move public, and it might be that there are things that need to be done to support that creativity at an early stage, which may be different from the things that people need later on. So it might depend exactly which types of engagement, activity, etc. you're looking to support. Speaking of putting in place support for activities, it's also worth noting that different groups and to different extents, do people actually want any additional support at all? So we've given that range of options you saw there as different ways that people might want support to kind of further their creative activity. But in the same way that we saw differences in the behaviour by older groups and by non-attenders to sort of in-person activity, we also see very different attitudes in terms of wanting any support. So there is an extent to which, I guess, maybe those who are both younger and both more kind of engaged in person cultural attendance are also more likely to want, maybe expect, maybe to feel entitled to, interesting question, some kind of way of furthering that activity, where there's a tendency for that to be less the case for the opposite groups. So, for example, there you see, as people get relatively older, yes, they're less likely to want to take part in participatory activities, but also, even of those that do, they sort of expect to be doing it more independently without additional support. So again, that might be something interesting to factor into thinking. So this is a few sort of different strands we've managed to pull out of this particular line of questioning. But I'm going to pass over to John, who will say a bit about the wider project that this is involved in. There's some reflections on this. Then maybe we have a bit of a discussion as well after. So over to you, John.
Hi everybody. I'm just going to go to my exit full screen. There we go. So yeah, sort of following on from that, I just want to give you a little bit of context before I jump in on some responses. So as I mentioned earlier in the year, at the Centre for Cultural Value, we published a research digest on everyday creativity, which was based on consultation with third sector partners, voluntary groups, policymakers, academics, cultural sector stakeholders, amongst many other people. Alongside that, we did a systematic lit review of the peer review literature and studies on everyday creativity. And following on from that, the digest recommended through that kind of process, we designed some recommendations really that sort of emerged around the lack of engagement data and what people are doing in their homes and about that home environment. So we asked Ollie and team to put some questions in, as is already mentioned, into the participation monitor. And this was part of also a joint project with ACE and TAA. To look at everyday creativity. And we also wanted to see if the monitor actually correlated or came up with any kind of differences to what we had found in the more sort of qualitative literature. So if this brings me to the first slide, if you can put the next one. Yeah. So I thought I'd return to this slide because this was kind of the top line really of what we found as well, that there was a significant increase in activity as a result of the pandemic, and actually studies that we reviewed that were during the pandemic and just after that have been published sort of correlate with this view. We didn't actually have any data specifically on people actually doing this. So now that we have this really kind of can begin to talk to that kind of finding really, which is really important. Interestingly, we actually did a little bit of a broader longitudinal analysis, and since sort of 2008 to now, there has actually been an steady increase in people being more creative. And there's all sorts of factors that are really beyond this current tea break to speak about on that kind of point of view. But it is a kind of question that maybe this is just a kind of almost a sample of a trend sort of thing going on. And maybe we need to think about that a little bit. But what was really interesting sort of within this debate as well was that across the actual literature, we found that there was a real kind of uncertainty about what was included in sort of definitions of everyday creativity. The purpose of the digest wasn't to define that at all, actually, and it was to play a more holistic role. But actually, what has happened in this with the monitor, actually, and the increase in sort of art forms and activity that has happened with the extra stuff that you put in has kind of opened up that question again, and especially when we see more people kind of suggesting that they take part in these sort of forms of creativity. There's something really interesting going on there, and it's something to do with value maybe as well, what is kind of valued, which is really also interesting. So if we go to the next slide, the reason I wanted to bring this up as well, can we get the yes, that's the one. That's what I wanted. So although we've seen this increase in participation across the board, these newly added categories have made a more holistic outcome, and one which sort of tallies with our own findings, but in a very specific way. So the chart on the right shows that more people are kind of doing more than one activity, and it kind of speaks to this finding that we had across the studies, particularly studies that looked at people's daily routines. So there's quite a lot, especially within the sort of field of psychology and creative psychology, around the sort of the importance of kind of participation in a longitudinal way across people's daily routines and activities. And these studies actually used daily diary records to kind of track this really. There's some really interesting stuff about what is valued through that process, and it points to sort of participants when they were saying that they don't really distinguish between art forms necessarily in the home, and actually what they do is just about the activity and doing the activity itself. So I mean, I'm even using the words art forms, which people don't necessarily use as well. So actually it's more about the kind of like the act is valued rather than necessarily the outcome. And actually, it's more about these intrinsic values related to kind of cultural engagement or creative engagement, which makes people feel something as opposed to the specific product and output. So I think there's something there in that people picking the lots of different sort of activities that they do and adding in food, adding in those different categories kind of speaks to that a little bit. So I think there needs to be some more sort of research around the qual and quant of that. And actually that would be a really interesting sort of place to go, which is quite difficult in a monitor like this, but sort of between lots of different methodologies, maybe something could be done. And I thought finally, just very quickly, because I'm aware of time and I want discussion really, I thought what was interesting really as a start is this, that everybody was more likely to do creativity in the home. I know within the actual monitor itself, there is some more nuanced sort of data coming out about this, but it was a little conflicting with our survey, because our survey suggested that participation in everyday creativity in the home often led to reaching out or sharing with others, and even forming groups and networks, or even kind of things like knitter natter groups and reading groups, and even kind of maker spaces. And it was about then sort of sharing that experience through the creative activity. And I know that the data kind of captures this a little bit in other places that we haven't really spoken to much today, other than the last slide that you were talking about, Oliver, actually, about those things that may help everyday creativity, or at least kind of help facilitate or help audiences engage and people engage. So I think there's something there that's really interesting to kind of think about. And it was actually slightly lower than I expected, was the participation outside the home, I think, across the data. And I just wonder whether there's something that's been missed in that interlinking, because I know that with younger people, for example, their use of social media was really high in actually doing creative activities. So maybe the sharing, actually, it doesn't necessarily have to be physical, maybe it's virtual, and the searching out, the sharing outside the home is that in that space. It doesn't necessarily have to be a physical space, does it? So I think there's something really kind of interesting there. And also sort of on another note, sort of from the research side, often I think what cultural researchers guilty of is focusing on the visible and what is easily accessed. So groups, obviously, and kind of locally based organizations and kind of things like scouts and things like that are actually obviously for researchers, it's easier to approach that than in the home, in this kind of private space. So I think there may be a skew in the general kind of sort of qualitative research that's out there that is kind of missing these nuances and these kind of links between the home and the external, so to speak, because it's not just like a binary. I think it's sort of more fluid, really. So yeah, I think that's probably enough from me and about my 5 minutes. So yeah.
Well, thanks, Carl. I certainly think there's an interesting challenge which we're trying to address with this slightly different way of looking at the questions.
Yeah.
Where the more you kind of broaden out the definitions, the more you break down the kind of nice, easy, there's people that gaze and people that don't. There's people that sort of super into the arts, people that aren't, which is, I think, both truer, but also slightly more subtle to then have to handle in terms of what you can then say about each group. Lovely. Okay, so that was just a brief digest from us, and there were other questions that we did ask about participatory activity in the monitor, and we'll include those when we write this up subsequently. Things about which activities people wanted to do differently, better, more detail about who people do activities with as well. So do they do it alone, do they do it with groups, people they live with, people they don't. But there we are. That was an initial snapshot. But yeah, I'd be really interested to hear any reflections on this, or just reflections on your own experience, or your own what you've seen people doing or not doing in terms of participatory activity.